Hello and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Erol Yayboke. I'm a senior fellow with the International Security Program, and I also direct the project on fragility and mobility. I'm really excited today to host my friend and colleague, Dr. Jennifer Sciubba. Jen is an internationally recognized expert in the field of demographic security. She has studied at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research and received her PhD in government and politics from the University of Maryland, just up the road from where we are here in Washington, D.C. She's the author of The Future Faces of War, Population and National Security, and the editor of a recent book, A Research Agenda for Political Demography. Dr. Sciubba is a member of Phi Beta Kappa and on the executive committee of the Population Reference Bureau's Board of Trustees. And she's a non-resident senior associate here with us at the International Security Program at CSIS, and is also affiliated with the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, also here in Washington, D.C. As if that wasn't enough for her, she's an associate professor in the Department of International Studies at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, one of the country's leading liberal arts colleges. Most importantly, perhaps, she is the author of a recent book that just came out entitled 8 Billion and Counting: How Sex, Death, and Migration Shape Our World. And we're here to talk about that book. Jen, I'm so grateful that you took the time to do this.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be able to share this book with you and everyone here at CSIS.
Well, I bought the book, and I encourage everyone to do so because it's a really phenomenal bit of research. Tell us a little bit about the book. So why now? Why this book? I feel like demographics has been a subject that people have looked at, but I'm not going to get ahead of it. But this book's a little different. So tell us a little bit about it and why you wrote this book now.
Sure. Well, we're about to have our 8 billionth baby born in the world, and those milestones are happening increasingly rarely because global population growth is slowing. And so I remember very vividly when we hit 6 billion people, because I was in college then. I was a professor when we hit 7 billion people. And I know that when these milestones happen, it is a great time for us to stop and take stock of who we are, the 8 billion of us on the planet. And I also know how much it's changed, this who we are question, from the 2 milestones that I remember from my adult life. So I know there's a lot of conversations that are really ramping up starting now about what a world of 8 billion people looks like. And in my time in the classroom and working with policymakers and business communities, I know that people know a lot about demographics, but they know really basic things. Maybe where population growth is concentrated or trends in urbanization, so on. And there's not a lot of understanding of context. So I wrote this book really as a way to situate demographic trends in a broader context, because I'm a political scientist, so that when we're having these conversations about who we are as 8 billion people, we have the kind of nuance we need to really understand that.
I'm so glad you wrote it, and I'm so glad that you're here at CSIS to talk about it. One thing I wanted to make clear that I understand and that our viewers understand is when you talk about this growth, you talk about it in the introduction actually of the book, is it took us until the early 1800s to get to the first billion,
1 billion
people.
yeah.
And then since 1804, I believe it was, there's just been exponential growth and so what I'm hearing from you is that we assume that exponential growth will continue exponentially, right. But what I'm hearing from you is that's not actually what demographers are thinking the future is.
No, and one of the things that I've really noticed, even as I've shared the book recently, is that people's first impressions of demographic trends, if you think about when you first grew this awareness of demographic trends, they're really sticky and they're really hard to undo. And I've even experienced that myself. But it's demographic trends have really changed. I think particularly here in the 2020s, we're at a point where the future is not going to look like the past. And that's why we really need to have these conversations. Last century was this exponential growth, as you said, 1.6 billion people to 6.1 billion.
Wow.
And I know we're already at 8, but as I said, we're slowing. And what we're really going into is an aging world. I mean, countries that we've thought of as young and growing are becoming some of the fastest aging countries on the planet, like Thailand, for example. I'm not sure a lot of us really grasp that population aging is spread around the world. I mean, global fertility is nearly half of what it was just 50 years ago.
And why is that aging happening? Why is the population leveling out?
So in general, we are having fewer babies and we're living longer. And I think while there's a lot of doomsday around population, just in general, I think most of the time when people talk about population trends, they're only talking about it as if whatever's happening is negative. It's definitely nothing that's happening is good. But I think we should put a different lens on this and understand that the reason that people are having fewer children overall, so we're going to go real global here, is because we know that if we have children, they're likely to make it to adulthood. So we might not have 4 or 5 children. We know that we can put household resources and time towards a smaller family. And then for us to be living longer, yay, that's a great thing, of course. So we're really moving towards this kind of progress in quality of human life.
Yeah, I hope my 2 kids make it to adulthood.
It's hard to say that because you're like, oh.
I know, but I think, one thing you point out is that when AD time, so AD 1, I think it was 10 years was the life expectancy or something?
Yeah, we've made so much stride in infant and child mortality in particular. I mean, that's really the first thing you see as a society start to have longer lifespans is getting people to live to adulthood. And then now with our medicine and technology and food and all those things, we're living even longer beyond that. It's not just gains at the beginning of life, but gains at the end of life as well. Look at a country like Japan.
Which gets a lot of attention here in DC and around the world as an aging society, and they're having to deal with that. You mentioned doomsday before, which is a term I am totally going to steal because I think it's great. There's lots of doomsday about youth bulges and aging and how that could lead to the economic downfall of the Japans or the United States of the world. And in a lot of those places, migration and immigration is certainly politicized and remains relatively low, or perhaps not at the level needed to compensate for slowing birth rates. So can you talk a little bit more, like when someone says youth bulge to you and there's a little bit of doomsday involved, what's your response to that?
I think the first thing that I would say to anyone is not every country in the world with a lot of youth is mired in conflict and poverty. And I think that's where being a political scientist who uses demographics is really useful, because it helps you, that should prompt questions like, well, why is that the case? Under what conditions is a youth bulge age structure more likely to lead to coups, rebellions, and so on? And so we do know some of these things. So when we think about a youth bulge age structure, it's useful to picture a population. And in fact, we'll actually start with some aging, and if we could put this slide up. So what you see here on the screen is this outline of a population. I know everyone's going to want to look at the details of this because we can't help it, but just squint your eyes and look at the shape of the population. It gives you this snapshot in time. And you can actually cut off these countries at the bottom and pretend like those are the youngest ages, and then you're looking backwards in time. That's what's so fun about population pyramids. But we can see points in time where a youth bulge would be the bulk of the population of these ages entering the workforce. So what we see here is Russia, the United States, and China, 3 countries with sub-replacement fertility. And so we'll talk about them as aging countries, but a youth bulge age structure would look more like a classic population pyramid. So the concern really is, and this is what political scientists are really trying to figure out, under what conditions does that lead to civil conflict? Because we know that these countries are more likely to have those outbreaks. And part of what we find is that countries where the youth population is well educated but without the job opportunities, they end up having a lot of grievances against whoever is in charge at the time. And this is particularly the concept of relative deprivation comes in here as well. If you didn't do as well as your parents, you feel relatively deprived. You had expectations and they're unmet. And I think that would be a great shorthand for explaining youth bulge and conflict, unmet expectations. And then of course there's a low opportunity cost. If you are not able to afford to get married, you don't have that social structure for you, you don't have a job perhaps, and sometimes you're also excluded from having a political voice, you have a low opportunity cost of engaging in violent action. And so those are the kinds of conditions that we see where a youth bulge becomes more of a challenge than an opportunity. But we also have to flip that script to understand that youth bulges can be an opportunity. I mean, look at East Asia as a region, for example. When they had the bulk of the population of working ages and entering working ages, that's when we really see this tremendous growth in the economies there.
That's fascinating. I'm going to make a big guess here that when you wrote your book proposal versus when this came out in 2020, the world looks a bit different than it did when you wrote your book proposal. So how did that change? How did the onset of the pandemic, for example, change the book? And was there anything in particular that surprised you about when you were writing this?
Sure. Well, you know, you're finishing a book and then you think it's all done, and then the publisher says, don't forget to put COVID in there. And, you know, I really had to sit and think, so many authors will know what I'm talking about. Everybody's kind of had to scramble to stick COVID in there. But you want to do it in a really genuine way. And I really sat back and thought, well, I've already covered pandemics in here, so that was convenient, I suppose. And all of those lessons about pandemics, they just really continued to apply. So I chose not to go in and wholesale change anything in the book because I didn't need to. And I think that is really what I tried to make the value added of this book. It is not just, hey, let me tell you what today's demographic trends are. Because by the time that book gets out there in the public eye, it'd be out of date. So the book is, how can any of us ask better questions about why demography matters? And so I really try to give a set of lessons and takeaways that people can take back into their own work to look at demographic trends. But with COVID, what I see is not so much a shift in fertility, mortality, and migration trends, the three building blocks of population, but an intensification of those trends already. Fertility was already on the downslope. COVID kind of accelerates that. Mortality in the United States was already not looking so good. Our life expectancy was falling before the pandemic, which should be a red flag for us. And so that intensifies as we go into COVID. It just really highlighted and made clear a lot of these things. I mean, even migration to the United States, I know one of the things in higher ed we pay attention to is interest from international students in coming to the U.S., and that was really already in danger, and the trend was changing before COVID happened.
Yeah, for all sorts of probably political and other reasons that we can go into. You mentioned that one of the goals of this is you want people to be asking better questions. What's your target audience here? I mean, obviously you hope everybody buys the book, and it's certainly written in a way that's accessible to everyone. I'll just make that plug. But who do you really hope reads this?
I think people who have a say in shaping our future. That there are people, whether or not they're in government or business or advocacy communities, classrooms, et cetera, who have to think about where we'll be in the future. And that is my target audience, because those are the people that I want to understand how population does shape the future, which is in the subtitle, of course. I think a demographic lens is really useful for people who think about the future because people are already born. I was thinking yesterday about how these babies that are learning to take their first steps today, they'll be walking to the voting polls in just less than 2 decades. So it's nice because we can already understand, how many retirees will we have in the future? Well, they're already born and working today. So I think that kind of lens is really useful, but we also have to have this context in there because the same demographic trend does not have the same outcome in different contexts.
When you talk about, so you're on a book tour right now, you're doing similar conversations, you're going to book festivals, and you're also talking to policymakers and business leaders. What's the biggest challenge you face when trying to educate those folks about why population matters and what they should take from this?
Well, I would say there are two. I mean, the one is how sticky these initial impressions are. And so I'm actually going to show one other slide that might surprise some people. I don't know. All right, what I think you're seeing on your screen here is in 1968, if we look at all the countries in the world where the average total fertility rate, this would be, how many babies do women have on average in a country? And if those with 5 or more, it was 127 countries.
Wow.
Which I don't know how many we would have counted, how many countries in 1968, fewer than now. And so it was nearly everybody.
I don't know a single family that has 5
Sure.
kids.
But this was the norm. It was very high, and that's why, this was really the heyday. I teach environmental politics and the history of that, of, zero population growth movement. Lots of listeners will know. And a lot of audiences I talk to, they came of adult age around 1968. So with 127 countries with fertility that high, I think that if those are the people in charge today, and you're having a climate change discussion, for example, and we all know climate change has really resurged on the agenda, and that's something our project looks at here at CSIS, it's no wonder that population is really infused in that. By the time I came of age, and also you as well, there were only 39 countries with a total fertility rate of 5 or more. And then today, there are just 8. And when I ran those numbers for, I think I did this for a newsletter edition a couple of weeks ago, I was even surprised doing that. And I thought, wow, how sticky are my impressions that so much of what I've written about for the national security community over the years is these really high fertility societies. But things have changed. Doesn't mean we shouldn't still talk about those 8, because those 8 are some pretty important countries. Nigeria would be one of them. But this stickiness, I think, it's hard to undo our initial impressions. The second thing I think I would latch onto, like what is hard about telling people about this book and getting them on board with this contextual analysis, is that desirability bias. So often people see what they want to see. And so on your screen now, I think you're seeing Russia, United States, and China. And when I was fortunate enough to work for the government in the mid-2000s, this is a time when Russia's population was shrinking sometimes by 600,000 people a year.
Wow.
I mean, this was when we had all of those headlines, Russia's drunken population. And I mean, we knew they had these terrible problems with alcoholism. And in the national security community, I heard over and over that Russia's demographics would be the number one thing that really put a ceiling on their power, that held them back, would keep them from being a great power. Because how could a country be a great power when life expectancy for men is 58? It was really unfathomable. But then that idea, this demography is destiny idea, I think made its way into our planning for the future. And I heard the same conversations about China, by the way. A lot of talk at the time that China was just going to grow old too quickly, and that would cause internal instability. But I think people see what they want to see, and they discount, one thing they discount is how similar the United States, Russia, and China are. Our total fertility rates, really similar. Life expectancy, still different when we look at Russia, but median age, about 38 to 39 years old, and proportion of the population above age 65, it is all really similar. But those statistics don't look the same in each country, and that's because the institutions or the rules of the game really matter.
So you talked about climate, and I want to come back to that in a second, but let me pull this Russia thread a little bit. This book went to print before Russia invaded Ukraine. Were you, given what you know about population and what you just said about Russia's demographics not necessarily spelling a peaceful future. Were you surprised by that? How did your population understanding, your demographic analysis brain, how did it process what happened in Russia?
I mean, I would say,
Ukraine,
I would think Russia's really one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I kept hearing that thesis, and particularly the thesis, the general one, that an aging world will be a more peaceful world. And as a political scientist, I just do not see that. I think it's a big mistake to assume that an aging world will be a more peaceful one. So it's unfortunate that this is the case because of the people in Ukraine, but fortunate for me as a writer that what happened with Russia's invasion of Ukraine seamlessly fit the narrative that I was telling about the relationship between aging states and projection of power. And I think part of the issue where we are misinterpreting this is that the past is not necessarily the precedent. I'm going to pull up just 2 more slides here. So I think we could buy into the idea that the future world of aging states would be more peaceful because the first countries in the world to age, and what we mean here by aging is just line everybody in the country up, youngest to oldest, ask the middle person to raise their hand, and you see that age of that middle person go up over time. So in the year 2000, all these little dots on the screen are the countries in the world that had median ages of 35 and above. And all the green dots, which is all but 3, were democracies. And so there were only 3 non-democracies, and this is just using Freedom House, just for a quick and easy visualization, Belarus and Russia, and there's 2 partly free and 1 unfree. So if you're thinking about the relationship between peace and population aging, well, we got to go back into this, democratic peace theory, not demographic peace theory. But look at it today already. So there's a lot more confetti colors here in the year 2020, just a couple years ago. First of all, you should notice there are far more. Look at the number of dots. We are an aging world. Far more countries with a median age of 35 and above. And there's a lot more institutional diversity. So that's the thing I would latch onto here to say. The aging states of today and tomorrow are not democracies. So we don't just throw out what we know about behavior in authoritarian regimes because the country's demographics changed. Those things still apply. And so another big takeaway from the book, infused in every chapter, is that the rules of the game matter and institutions matter.
Institutions matter. And when we think about, I want to pull the climate thread here for a second, because it's like you said, very much on the agenda, getting a lot of oxygen in the Biden administration and around the world for, I would say, good reason. How big of a problem is population in the climate conversation? I feel like some of what gets talked about by people who don't understand demography and population is more people means more emissions, it means more trash, it means sort of more effect on the environment and climate. So how do you analyze the role of population growth or decline or what you talk about in the book in climate change?
I've gotten kind of salty about this as the years have gone on. It's because I feel like I have seen too much population used as an excuse for inaction. So if people let's just say people in the West or Americans are having discussions about climate and they put the population variable in there, it becomes there are too many people and that's why we have a climate issue. But if the most developed countries in the world have negative population growth, many of them, or have really slow population growth, who exactly is it that's having too many babies? And of course, we know, and yet it doesn't make its way into as the core of the conversation, it's consumption. It's the rich people. So where I get really salty is I often say, are you vegan? And if the answer is no, then let's stop talking about population. Like we could just stop right there. I am not perfect, by the way. I consume all kinds of things. I was talking about shopping earlier. I am the problem. And my children are the problem. We overconsume and we are causing this warming world. So I almost feel like I've started to get so, to where I want to swing the conversation the other way to say, I don't even want to talk about population at all because I want to talk about consumption and get this idea that there are too many babies out of the way. But I'm also, as someone who teaches environmental politics, acutely aware that there are stresses between population and resources. And you see this and write about this all the time through your project. And I think if we change our level of analysis, and actually we could even take the word climate out of it and just talk about what we know for decades and decades, that population does place stresses on the environment. It does. I mean, Madagascar is a great case where you look at, it's like this closed system, of course, and population growth was exponential. And what happens in terms of deforestation and biodiversity and food for people and health for people? I mean, there are real consequences to population growth. So I think it would be most constructive if we could somehow have two different conversations where we said, with climate, let's focus on overconsumption and make everything about the richest countries in the world. And at the same time, let's understand that some of our development and environmental challenges are in part caused from population stresses.
That's so fascinating and really does reframe the conversation. I feel like the solutions to climate change are always easier if they're there.
Yeah, for sure.
And the solutions are here.
Yeah.
And they're consumption based, they're not necessarily population growth based. But like you said, it doesn't diminish the need to manage the environment well in places that have high population growth.
Yeah.
That is fascinating. You talk in the book a lot about policies. And the importance of government and sort of policies in shaping the future. Can you give an example or two of where that is really playing out?
Sure. Let's go to this slide here. So Nigeria is one of the fastest growing countries in the world. They're one of those 8 that has over 5 children on average per woman. And I think if you go back in your mind to this slide where we said we went from 127 to 8, a lot of that was policy. More education, keep people in school longer, raise the age at first marriage, because child marriage is still a thing in many parts of the world. In fact, the places where fertility is the highest, often women are married very young. And policies can make a difference. What we see on the screen here are some projections. They're just 3 of an infinite number of projections we could have about where Nigeria's fertility might go in the future. And by the way, what's not up there is constant fertility, which is what if nothing changes, and just draw the line straight over. I mean, often when I talk to policymakers, I use constant fertility because I think it's more important to say, if nothing changes, this is where you'll be. Now, where do you want to shape the future? So we can invest today to shape the future we want tomorrow. And we know that with Nigeria, which is set to eclipse the United States as the world's 3rd most populous country, I think it doubles again between now and mid-century. Countries with this type of demographics, this age structure, overall they have lower educational attainment, more likely to have conflict, persistent. So in 1950, Botswana actually had higher fertility than Nigeria did. But starting in the 1970s, policymakers there really invested in free secondary education. Women now actually outnumber men in terms of that. They integrated family planning and reproductive health programs in general medicine and really made that available. And so we see this fork of 3 different projections. As I said, though, there are infinite numbers. What if they don't follow any of those? What if at this moment they put in place a set of policies that sends them on a path more like Botswana, where fertility is now 2.89. And these are rights-based family planning, by the way. I think one danger of also the overpopulation discourse is that you can end up with some non-rights-based policies for sterilization and so on. And so this is just giving people the choice as to how many children do you want to have, and here's a means to act on that through family planning.
Yeah, carrots, not sticks.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to talk about politics a little bit. Migration, as you know, it's one of the things that I study here, and I'm fascinated personally by politics. And migration, or I guess more specifically immigration, continues to dominate imaginations of voters and political agendas. we saw this in the Ohio primary that just happened this week. It continues, and I would guess here in the United States it's going to be on the agenda for the midterms and even the 2024 election and potentially beyond. How big of a role do you think immigration will play in shaping the future, the demographic future that you talk about, and what impact will that have on our politics? I feel like it's so easy to think that this is a disruptor, but what's your analysis?
I know you may not like how I reframe this question, but I would say, how big of a role will we let it have? Because the bottom line is, immigration is a policy choice. And every country in the world has a debate about who are we, and based on this conversation about who we are, who do we let come in and live here and settle here? And we see such a variety of outcomes around the world. Because I study population aging primarily, I will often have people, casual conversations, they'll say, wow, yes, population aging is so important. All these aging countries are going to have to open to immigrants. But it's that have to that I take issue with, because people don't have to open to immigration. That is the choice they make. You look at Japan, it's the most aged country on the planet, the highest median age. I think it's 48 right now. And they have chosen not to adapt to population aging by bringing in more immigrants. And I choose those words carefully because it is, like climate change, about adaptations. In the United States, our rules of the game, our institutions yet again, have actually baked in an adaptation to population aging. I mean, we have sub-replacement fertility, but we still have had a growing population because we had rules that allowed immigrants to come in. But it is still a conversation that happens. So I would say, if you're a business leader and you're counting on a continued growing United States, I hope you're paying attention to the immigration debate, because it is not guaranteed that those rules will stay the same. And I think for every country in the world, we should not assume greater mobility in the future, because there is a lot of backlash to how migration changes societies. I mean, people, it's not like you just move bodies or you just move a worker. Every person brings with them their ethnicity, their gender, their own politics and religion and culture. And it's the fear of what that does to the who we are that I think drives a lot of the political discourse around the world.
So if you're talking to a German or a Japanese policymaker and you're pointing out that they have lower than replacement rate, which I'm guessing means just people are having less than 2 kids.
Yeah.
Here in the United States, it's 1.9 based on the last census. So in Germany, we know that that's been negative or declining, and in Japan, as you mentioned. So how are you talking to those policymakers about the role of immigration in that future that has less population?
It is just but one of many options on a menu of adaptation. And I don't think it's my role to force to even put the line out there that if you're a country where your people have decided that this is where you want to set your level, that I should come in and say you have to change this, because there are so many other things that countries can do. Now, I also don't want to come across as somebody who is not in favor of immigration, and read the book and you'll be easily can see that's not the case. But it's, I'm coming at this from a data and a political science, scholar perspective. And there are so many other things that countries can do instead of immigration, or in addition to immigration. I mean, the best policies, of course, are always these really comprehensive packages. Female labor force participation rates in pretty much every OECD country are low. There are women who say they would like to work, but the way that our system is set up, they're not supported in seeking that work outside the home. Well, you don't have to bring in people from the outside when you have a tremendous resource here as well. So a lot can be done to make it the case that women could work and also have families if they choose to do so. I mean, all of this is, if this is what you choose. Also keeping older people in the workforce longer. There is a graph that I have in the book that looks at the effective retirement age the age people actually retire, which is different from the official retirement age across the OECD. And this differs by like 15 years across these countries. And so think about that is a tremendous proportion of the workforce, potential workforce, that you could draw on as a resource. And immigrants are also a potential resource. And I know that so many businesses in the United States have had a hard time getting workers to fill positions that immigrants they're ready to go with the skills to fill. And the rules of the game are set up such that they can't do that. So you can look at all of these things together and understand that you don't just sit passively by and say, oh, well, our country is aging and our workforce is shrinking. There's so many things that can be done.
Yeah, it's almost too convenient and intellectually dishonest to say, oh, immigration will just fix it.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's part of a solution set when deployed really thoughtfully. Mm-hmm. It was interesting you talked about people working longer. My Turkish grandfather retired in his mid-50s.
Yeah.
And as someone who has just approached or just entered his 40s, that terrifies me.
Yeah.
And so I think, part of the solution set being facilitating people being productive and sort of the aging economy, you hear this term a lot, is I think really an important part of the solution set. So I'm really grateful,
thank you,
Dr. Sciubba, that you came and did this. If you were to leave viewers with kind of one, let's say a tweet length kind of takeaway from this, what would be your bumper sticker? What do you want people to come away from this conversation with as it relates to this book?
I think our world of 8 billion is going to be a world where we have so many opportunities. I was so surprised to finish this book and be an optimist about world population. As I said, kind of bookending where we started. But I think, there are places in the world, of course, we talk a lot about hotspots, given what we do in a national security framework in the world where there's a lot of stresses and a lot of trouble, but I think that overall we're really moving to a better future. So I hope that people will read the book and think deeply about how can we invest today to shape the future that we want tomorrow. And that sounds very bumper stickery or tweet-like, but it's a real question, because I think in every sector out there are all kinds of policies that can be put in place that take advantage of the resource that is our 8 billion people that we have today. I mean, it's a tremendous resource for us. And I don't know that we are doing enough intentional thinking about all the opportunities, because we focus so much on the challenges.
I have one last question for you. Would you sign my book?
Absolutely, of course I will. And thank you so much for hosting me here.
I'm so glad that you were able to come. And Dr. Jennifer Sciubba, author of this really excellent new book, 8 Billion and Counting. I hope that you'll pick it up. Jen, thank you.
Thank you, Erol.
And look forward to having you back at CSIS very soon.
Yes, thank you so much.